Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know many of you, but not all of you, so I'm going to just take a little time to do an introduction. My name is Claudine Locascio. I'm the Executive Director of Japan America Society of Colorado, and welcome to our webinar entitled COVID-19 Perspectives from Japan. We had over 70 people registered today, and I must say this is one of the silver linings to this interesting new world that we find ourselves in, and that has been the strength of our national Japan America Society network has really shined through and enabled us all to band together in a way that we really had never done before. These virtual programs are ongoing around the country. We've been diligently sending out that information to our members, and I encourage you to take advantage of this, this very interesting time and seeing all the different perspectives that are out there. Today, we're being joined by attendees in Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, Kansas City, Toronto and Vancouver in Canada, Alabama, Tennessee, Japan, and of course, all throughout Colorado. Just a little bit about us. Japan America Society of Colorado is a nonprofit organization dedicated to building and strengthening people-to-people relationships between Colorado and Japan through business, civic, education, and cultural experiences. Our office is located in downtown Denver, just across the street from the state capitol, although currently we're operating in the Denver Tech Center out of my house. Under normal circumstances, our programming is extensive and serves as a primary source of operating funds for us. So right now we're in a situation where we are relying extensively on membership and donations to sustain ourselves. If any of you here today are not a member of Japan America Society of Colorado or your own local Japan America Society, I would definitely encourage you to consider that method of support. You can also make a tax-deductible donation through our website at jascolorado.org. Sorry, I do have to say that, and I would greatly appreciate that. And just before I loop in our panelists, I would like to just take a moment and recognize some very loyal, high-level investor and benefactor-level members of our Japan America Society here in Colorado. They are Denver International Airport, United Airlines, Panasonic, Colorado Air and Spaceport, and Adams County. And our benefactor level members are Mount Princeton Hot Springs Resort, Lewis Roca Roth River Christie, Denver Economic Development and Opportunity, and Sakurada Square. It is truly thanks to their ongoing support, and they have pledged to continue their support during this time, that we are able to do what we can do. And so I'm very thankful. And I'm especially thankful to our panelists today. I think it's 7:30 in the morning there in Tokyo. So I hope you guys have maybe had some coffee or gotten your day off, started off well. I do not plan to reread their bios. I think you all saw that in the invitation that was sent out, but maybe you could each give us a little Jiko Shokai self-introduction before we jump in. So David, would you like to start?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Good morning in Tokyo. David Wagner here. So I've been a member on and off of the Colorado Japan America Society since the late 80s, and I spend about half my time here in Tokyo. So if you want to know more, Google or go on LinkedIn and take a look.
Dylan?
Yeah, so it's great to be here with everybody. It's great to see we've got a large group joining today. So yeah, Dylan Scudder, and I'm a strategic management advisor and coach. I lecture here at Sophia University in Tokyo and run problem-solving workshops for companies on the side.
Fantastic, thank you. Just a bit of housekeeping. We did ask for questions in advance, and thank you to those who did send them in. If you were not able to do that, or you think of something during the presentation, please use the Q&A window down at the bottom there. That's where I'll be monitoring questions that come in rather than the raise hand function. I think it's a little easier for me to moderate from that Q&A window. If for some reason we're running very late and I don't get to all of the questions, I will try to circle back and follow up with you afterwards. Okay, should we get started? Great. So David and Dylan, I'd like to start with your personal observations as you've been longtime residents of Tokyo. What are you observing in Tokyo now?
What I'm noticing here is really a consistent effort to pursue what I'd call an average strategy. So when I say average, I mean basically we're seeing that there's a constant monitoring of the landscape. So what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the US, what are the headline countries doing, how are they responding to specific issues, and then on that basis sort of identifying the middle. So in that sense, pursuing an average strategy or a strategy of finding the middle essentially. And then trying to balance that on the other end with, well, how could the public actually respond to this sort of similar degree? And then I think like in other countries, you'd see that here in Japan, we've pursued a two-track response. So any kind of news that you listen to, any sort of articles you might read, it's always this dichotomy. You've always got these two sides, one focusing on health, the other on the economy. So in that sense, I'll go ahead and try to kind of break down what I'm noticing here on both of those tracks. So in the early stage of the outbreak, if we go back, say, to January, February, I think the response on both tracks was mostly, monitoring and evaluating the situation. So as you would do, you need to collect data and see where you stand and then try to plan your next steps on that basis. Now, on the health side, there's very limited testing, and that's still the case. And partly as a result of this, there were conspicuously low numbers of reported cases, especially at the outset. Now, consistent with this, on the economy side, you can see that there was hesitation to lock down. I mean, really waited a long time before the state of emergency was announced. The turning point was probably around the time of Hanami, so our annual cherry blossom celebration here. There were mixed feelings still at that time about, whether it was safe to join in massive all-day picnics in large crowds. Now, since then, we've seen, I think, relatively low levels of people infected, but there has been a steady series of what you might think of as smaller peaks over the past weeks. And I think you'll notice that there's also been a kind of modest increase in testing in lockstep with that. And then, if you look at the different suggestions coming out of the government since then, it's basically been along the lines of, if you go out, please do wear masks. In parallel to this, we've experienced, I think, what you might think of as a reluctant or somewhat soft version of a lockdown with very limited enforcement. So if you need to go shopping, of course, you go out and do that kind of thing. The state of emergency and stay-at-home measures were just extended. So you might have heard we're going to be in this situation here in Japan anyway till the end of the month here in Tokyo. And then the overall bandwidth of measures, I think you could say overall until now have been what you might think of as moderate without the highs and lows that we see in other countries, especially compared with many states there in the U.S.
Yeah, so Dylan and I would agree that understanding both the US and Japan's strategy has been an ebbing and flowing process. So the US, as we know, was late to the game in terms of medical preparations and systemic testing, and so was Japan. But in the case of Japan, my impression is that they've been shooting for the middle, like Dylan's mentioned, not wanting to do anything too extreme. So they've watched the harsh lockdown approach in China and the systemic testing process in Taiwan and South Korea, as opposed to the West, which was, somewhere in between as well. Testing here is based on a strategy of finding clusters and outbreaks and then testing there. So that was clearly being done in places like Hokkaido and Osaka, where they did find clusters. The ones in Osaka were at music venues where everyone was sitting on top of each other, basically. So it seems that shooting for the middle has been a good approach for Japan thus far, and it's not surprising to me that that is the approach here. In terms of compliance, when I go out, I'm observing mostly people are not on the streets. I'd say 80% of the people that I see are wearing masks, and this includes a lot of non-Japanese. As for testing itself, as Dylan's kind of talked about, I mean, the numbers here in Tokyo keep going down. It's really interesting, even though the testing numbers are gradually going up in terms of tests performed. Yesterday, from the numbers on the Tokyo website, there were 32 cases, if you can believe that. And a couple weeks ago, it was close to 200. So, again, testing is only being done on people who have a fever of 37.5 Celsius for 4 days or more with respiratory issues and even fatigue. So it's not easy to get a test here. And I would, again, confirm that that's why the numbers are low.
That's interesting. So you touched on this a little bit, but what do you think is going right and what do you think is not going as well, Dylan?
Yeah, well, I think David just mentioned, Japan does kind of shoot for the middle. So I think anytime you pursue a strategy of compromise in that sense, you just agree from the outset to take some of the bad with the good. So, to be able to talk about what's going well, I like to think in terms of, well, first we've got to establish, well, what do we mean by good, just to be able to focus in on what would a good outcome look like. I think that the situation that we find ourselves in right now is sort of getting from whatever stage of infection we're at, we don't know. But from that stage up to, say, 60, 70% of the population infected, as they say, the herd immunity strategy, basically we need to move in that direction at a pace that the healthcare systems can also keep up with. So that's the basic idea, I think, that's catching on also in other countries. Now, at the same time, of course, you've got to increase your healthcare capacity as fast as possible in order to keep pace. And then in lockstep with that, you ease up on the restrictions. To do that, I think we need to be able to prioritize people with higher levels of risk. So we're hearing more about that as well. Clearly giving priority to the elderly, the frail. And then at the same time, letting people with lower levels of risk reintegrate. So there we're talking about, letting students get back to school and that kind of thing. To be able to do this, though, you do need that mass testing. And I think this also has to be, of course, very reliable testing. And these are issues in themselves we could spend hours on, but that has to be flagged. And then it seems that there is currently only, very limited access to that kind of testing. So we're still left with a really big question of what to do with that information. Even if you did know it, what would you be able to do with that information that you couldn't do before?
Yeah, right. And as I've noted, what's going right in Japan is basically the large acceptance of government requests to abide by the stay-at-home order. So respect for authority and group pressure has largely worked here. And as I say, largely because there still seem to be instances, again, where people have ignored the request, just like in the United States. And that's included some businesses until April 25th. April 25th was a magic day when the government requested specifically that more businesses close. And in line with that, it was a 12-day sort of close down request until the emergency declaration was extended just earlier this week. So in the third week of April also came an additional request to stop serving liquor at restaurants at 7 p.m. and to close the restaurant by 8 p.m. So, I had to wonder about the wisdom of such an approach and the logic behind it. I mean, what happens at 8 p.m.? The virus suddenly appears and it doesn't appear before 8 p.m. So, it seems like the strategy has been to gradually impose restrictions in baby steps. And I think agility is important in crisis mitigation, so they're doing that. I mean, on the medical front, there have been some bumps in the road, as you might expect, just like in the States. I hear cases where people are having trouble getting admitted to the hospital. And even when they're admitted to the hospital, their ailments, like a heart attack, may not be properly diagnosed, and PPE, personal protection equipment, may not be available. I know of one doctor who has one mask a day, and that's what he has to work with. So there's a PPE shortage. And another issue is ambulances not being accepted by hospitals. They have to go to different hospitals, sometimes dozens of times, to get a patient admitted. So is it, a shortage of beds, shortage of PPE, a shortage of staff, all of the above? It's hard to know. So on the positive side, the overall rates of infection, as I said, remain low. And again, that's because the testing is limited. And I think that in Tokyo proper, at the Kanto region, from the websites that I study, there have been only about 13,000 tests conducted for this entire city. And that's 37 million people. That's pretty astonishingly low.
Interesting. I'm hearing the same thing from doctor friends here in Colorado about the PPE and one per day. So that seems consistent.
Well, I just want to add, Claudine, that I think that US and Japan have almost similar strategies in a lot of ways. And it does bring up the issue that Dylan mentioned. Is the ultimate goal to achieve herd immunity because you don't test enough people, so people are getting infected? I mean, it's a really controversial topic, and I'm not going to go there because, we're not, Japan's not China and Japan's not Sweden. It's somewhere in the middle.
Right. How about your clients? You both have an extensive client list. What are you hearing from them?
Well,
Dylan, can you start?
yeah, just briefly there. I think it really does depend on the industry, of course. And in my case, it's really limited to three groups. I just work with companies and then universities and then some individuals. But of course, they all just want to shorten the distance between where they are now and getting back to some form of business. I think for companies, that means getting started on their plans to regroup, rebuild, recover. Then for universities, the ones I lecture at, they've all gone online. I think the same is happening there in the US and globally. And that means all my courses are online. A challenge that universities face is basically how do you replicate the learning experience that they were able to provide students in the traditional environments they had, well, for centuries, really. And then for individuals, as you might expect, I've seen an increase in requests for career planning, transitioning. And I think a lot of people are noticing that, when you're confined to your homes, especially, we need to be able to have some of our work or, perhaps even all of our work online. We need to be able to virtualize what we do and do it online. So if nothing else, we need that online option as a fallback in case we're ever in a similar or even worse situation again in the future. Unfortunately, this isn't as realistic for some people as it is for others, but I think we do need to even watch this space too to see how things develop in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, and I'm in the crisis management business. I help firms with strategy, design and implementation of issues that they have. And so, many of my clients were already really prepared for this pandemic. Governments, insurance, reinsurance industry has long sort of prepared for these kinds of events. It's the SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, not so much for obvious reasons. And in all fairness, most SMEs just don't think about this kind of thing. Even so, there is much that firms can do, like making sure that top management, has considered a multitude of scenarios such as vulnerability assessments to make sure their executive teams are ready to go. But I'd say overall, almost every firm was not ready for pandemic. Pandemic is not in their crisis manual, and I think that's going to change.
Interesting. So speaking of working virtually, how is that going? It seems to get a lot of press of this is going to be really hard in Japan, and there's been articles about the Honko and is that going to go away? And so how are companies handling working remotely?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I agree. It's been a challenge for a lot of firms here to do that. So, in Japan, most large firms to some degree were teleworking, already, especially the large global firms with international divisions. On the whole, Japanese firms have little experience doing so, and I think the number was less than 10% prior to the crisis. It's up to a little bit over 20% now from what I read. But where does this go from here? I mean, that's the question, and it's really hard to know because culture plays a role. I think everywhere in the world, firms are assessing how effective it is to work from home and what does that do to productivity and client engagement. And it's going on here too. There is the impression here among a lot of Japanese I know that working at home is not working, and you're not with your team. So that's important here. Group orientation is really powerful. But given that the vast number of workers in Japan simply just sit in front of their computers at the desk at the office anyway, why not expand teleworking? Why not reduce your rent costs?
Yeah, I've also, on that note, I've noted that we've all been working on computers and using the internet, video conferencing in one way or another for decades now, whether it's here in Japan or in other countries. But if we keep the focus on Japan, I think we have to consider the role of culture, as David mentioned. What that means is that basically anything that stands a chance of surviving here really has to adapt to culture. It's not the other way around. There might be some, cosmetic changes here and there, basically acknowledging that telework is now a thing, but we're not going to see traditional office workers replaced, by, say, a casual workforce of freelancers rolling up to their webcam with a coffee in one hand and a pet in the other. I think tele is one word here and work is another, and they don't go together. So there's no such thing as unsupervised work. But even before the crisis, I think there was never a big drive to spend more time at home. So I remember in my earlier years in Japan, I've been here 20 years now, which doesn't feel so long. The longer you're here, the more you realize there's a lot more to learn. But I do remember in those earlier years being really surprised to discover that the last thing people wanted, a lot of them, was to spend more time at home. So they'd say, like, what are you, crazy, spending more time in that noisy, cramped apartment? I'd much rather be in the office. So that's just how things are here. If anything, I think the disruptions caused by the stay-at-home measures that we're experiencing now will basically drive people back to the office with more focus than ever. So you'll have longer hours than you had before the crisis. People want to forget all about this and get back to something that they recognize as more normal. But if you really wanted to make teleworking like a realistic alternative, I think you'd have to start changing regulations and start rewarding people for producing, say, deliverables of reliable quality within competitive timeframes. What a lot of us just think of in the professional sector as business as usual. You wouldn't want to reward people for like the number of hours they spend in the office, for example.
Yeah, and I just add one comment, Claudine, that there are now virtual Honko, which is your personal stamp. So you don't have to be in the office and pass that envelope around with 100 people stamping it, which takes forever. You can do it online. So technology is aiding this process. And I think it's the challenge for Japan to maintain its cultural norms and historical values by using technology to streamline the process.
So do you think this would lead to a permanent change in any industry at all? Or I don't even know the answer to that here in the United States, to be quite frank. I wonder, though.
Yeah, so will this become permanent? It's hard to know. I think a lot of Japanese firms are going to embrace this concept as they already have. And most Japanese that I speak to actually prefer to be in the office. It helps with team synergy. And I know a number of Japanese who've been asked to not come to the office, but they still go anyway. So it's part of like what Dylan said, they just don't want to be at home for whatever reason. And I think the proof is in the pudding, right? Oddly, what this crisis will do in the short term is provide relief for Japan's labor shortage. So there is a labor shortage here, and as more businesses go out of business and cut staff, I think the unexpected result in the short-term number of years is going to be that the labor shortage is diminished because a lot of people are going to need work. So that's actually a positive for Japan that I don't think anybody was anticipating. And again, I could be wrong about that, but just doing the math, it sort of makes sense for now.
Yeah, I think David raises an important point there too, also about industry. So I think it does have a lot to do with industry, IT being an obvious one, but also the size of companies. So, the smaller startups are having some advantages, maybe in flexibility, agility, but also there's the role of culture. Again, I think we can't escape that discussion. So, culture can be in the traditional categories of, say, Western and Eastern, but, sometimes even more importantly, we think about organizational culture. Each company having its own flavor. And then, if you talk about change, whether it's permanent or not, I think there's also a universal reality that most people just don't like it. So they'll resist it in any case. And that's true here in Japan too. So, maybe especially here. But whereas we Americans were brought up on the optimistic idea that, scarcity is the mother of invention, and that crises also present opportunities, reality is that, they're much more likely to present opportunities to a small minority, but for most people, they just suck, So I think for a lot of people, they already know like how to use Zoom or, maybe even how to quickly switch over and share their screen and that kind of thing. That's all going to be forgotten as soon as the official announcement's out there that we can return to work and get on with things as we used to. There'll be a request to wear your mask in the office or something like that. But I think that's probably about the degree of, permanent change that we're going to see here.
I've got to believe that's very similar to what's going to happen here as well. This is, it's worked fine. But people do treasure their team and want to be together. So that's great. Okay, the shutdown, how is the shutdown going there? You have talked about this a bit, but can you focus a little bit on the businesses and there is a question specifically about family-owned restaurants, which is a huge concern in the United States as well. How's it going? And can they make it?
Yeah, I've noticed that, also David's touched on some of this, but it's probably a little early to say just now, with the effects will come out later. I think we'll have to wait and see, for example, some of the statistics to come out on alcohol consumption if we focus on the household situation. All of this spills over to the workplace, but just looking at the household situation first, unfortunately, you're also going to have, of course, a lot of suicide. You're going to have, domestic violence and all the effects that has on people. And then the overall damage to people's physical and psychological health. I think there are untold volumes of discussion that are going to come out of that. Are people even actually ready to get back to work? So this is going to be another discussion. Then, I think this is all going to depend greatly on who you ask. They're very different demographics and they're going to respond differently. It'll depend on their social status. Some of us have just, weathered the storm, of course, better than others would be in a position to. The nature of, every person's work is going to be quite distinct. So we'll have to distinguish between different work types. And then the overall ability just to sustain yourself, at the company level too. We'll have to kind of drill down, I think, and look at different industries and company sizes and that kind of thing. We'll need to see like how many small businesses were actually able to return, as we're talking about. And for how many of these small companies, this lockdown has actually stopped their, let's say, flow of oxygen for longer than they could actually hold out. But okay, just going by what we currently know, I think the shutdown is tolerated because most people just accept that the immediate cost of ending up in the hospital, that's really very easy for people to sort of be scared by. So that's going to naturally, like psychologically, that's going to outweigh some of the longer term costs to our physical or financial well-being, even though those are actually guaranteed at this stage.
Yes, so I would add to that I agree. The smaller size companies, SMEs, are going to have a harder time than the larger ones. And like a family-owned restaurant that you mentioned, Claudine, generally they've got cash on the side. They keep their cash in the safe at home, and this is what it's going to be used for, right? Some of it anyway. I think the savings rate and the overall conservative nature of business here means that there is more of a financial cushion for most people than compared in the US, where the savings rate is extremely low, although it's higher than it used to be. And I mean, a year ago here, Japan and Japanese firms were sitting on about $890 billion in cash to invest. And some of this was earmarked for overseas acquisitions. And of course, that also would make them a potential target with all that cash for acquisitions themselves and place pressure to return some of that cash to shareholders. But in times like now, the cash provides a healthy cushion for these firms. And I think the days of the $64 billion acquisition, like last year when Takeda acquired Shire, I think that's over for quite some time now. Japan's now faced, like many places in the world, with the prospect of a lower GDP. And that may lead to employee cuts and reduced salaries or reduced bonuses, which feeds into the economic abyss, right? So the sales tax, was raised last fall, about 10%, is now the total rate. And the OECD countries are supposed to estimate that Japan needs to get to about 15% for its overall sales tax rate, which is unlikely to be implemented right now. So we've got a lot of drags on the economy, and I say it's tough times ahead, particularly for Japan, as we have a depressed economy here.
And are most people abiding by the stay-at-home order? I think here it was pretty good for a while, but I think we're hitting a little bit of a wall. More and more people are venturing out, I would say.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing too. I mean, I go for a daily walk. I have a park right nearby, and I wear a mask. And I see lots of people doing the same thing, especially people with pets. And of course, there's no mechanism of enforcement here, and nobody's going to get arrested or fined. The trains are mostly empty. There are plenty of people, I think, walking around shopping every day to get their food, because Japanese like to shop every day. And I think, on the other hand, some people are just not following the rules at all, but they're in the extreme minority. There's more of an effort to rope off places like basketball courts and slides for kids. The taxis are running basically empty, but they're still going. They must have gotten some stimulus money. I think, people are aware that they need to keep their windows open for circulation. That message has come out pretty clear, and people are doing it. So people are educating themselves like in the States, and I think most people are doing a good job.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to start by thanking David for wearing a mask. So I'd like to thank anyone who wears a mask when they go for a walk here. Consistency is good. Otherwise, those of us who do wear a mask wonder why. But yeah, I think it's hard to know, just how many people are really abiding by the stay-at-home request here. We can speculate, based on what we've observed so far, though. And I think, this order wasn't really any kind of, say, martial law or anything like that. It was more of a, request not to go out unless it was for something, really important, like, say, shopping. But, with a loophole this big, of course, it's going to have, people that'll be more relaxed about abiding by it or ignoring the request even. So, we've heard some people say that responding to this pandemic is like going to war. I don't know, that dramatic kind of description doesn't really align with what I've been seeing or, the tone of what I've observed here on the ground. I think one reason for that might be due to, just Japan's legal system. So I think others have pointed out before that Japan isn't really expected to engage in war. It lacks that kind of justification, and it wouldn't be able to just clamp down like it might be under another constitution. But we're more about self-restraint here, and I think even with its shortcomings, I'd say that that's really the lesser evil in this kind of situation. So if there has to be a pandemic, I definitely prefer to be here in Japan than anywhere else.
That's a great point. What is your impression of the impact on the economy? That is a big question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. And there is a great question that came in from my colleague in Dallas about the international business community in Japan and how they're reacting to Japan's government's calls to move production out of China and back to Japan. Is that something that you're able to comment on?
Yeah, so let me start with that. I think there's a global movement to move production outside of China now. And I think I'm guessing here, just using my analytical skills, that as there are more jobs available because unemployment goes up here, that there will be an easier transition to move some production facilities back to Japan. But that's just shooting in the dark. I think this is a big topic, and it converges with the Olympics as a whole and tourism and population decline in Japan. So we know that the 2020 Olympics were postponed, and now there's talk of July 2021. I have my doubts, but who knows? Let's hope that they can do that. Will it be safe? Will people want to come? Will the athletes be willing to come? I mean, it was the athletes that nixed it this time. So it's all unknown, and I think tourism has taken a huge hit in the past number of months, as you can imagine, particularly from China, which is their bread and butter, really. I mean, the government has a target of 40 million tourists this year, and they're not going to make that. I think if they hit 20, I'd be surprised. So when we combine all of this with the population decline, the outlook for Japan is rather difficult. So let's remember that last year, 37 out of 47 prefectures saw population decline. And this trend is going to continue and starting to affect the Kanto region now as a whole. And as of last year, there were 8 million empty homes in Japan, and 13% of all dwellings were empty. So, this is a massive number affecting tax revenue in localities and business operations, et cetera. And I've long argued that Japan really needs to open up in a big way to immigration. They don't want to do that, but the numbers show that they need to. I mean, there's only so much women and robots can do to fill the gap. So again, with this economic decline, it may ease the problem for now, but not long term.
Yeah, I'm also noticing that the impact of the lockdown clearly in any country, it just can't be a good thing, not least for people's health and well-being, and all of that's inextricably, I think, connected with work, and we can't really separate health and economy. So according to the trade ministry here, 70% of the work population consists of small and medium-sized enterprise. So and these are the ones that are really hurting the most. So I think short term, you're going to see a lot of isolated stories of a few companies that might be repurposing to, say, make masks or machine parts for ventilators and that kind of thing. But, I worry that a lot of these stories or articles, might be just an attempt to echo some of the global narrative around ill-equipped ICU units. And okay, those seem to me to be more the exception than the rule. I think the biggest hit, of course, is going to be to the tourist industry, and we're going to have to see how that turns out also with the Olympic Games, whether those will actually be held or not. I think David mentioned that earlier. And, until then, I think, we can try to get an overview of the economic damage caused by the way we've decided to respond.
Boy, that Olympics topic is an interesting one, isn't it? That's a tough one for a lot of people.
A lot of money's been lost.
Oh my goodness.
I think the government itself has spent around $30 billion, and there's just a massive number of companies that produce product and advertising for these events. They took a bath, yeah.
It's tough. And the athletes, I think of those athletes who've worked for 4 years. It's tough.
Right.
So, you did touch on tourism a bit, so you can expand on that a little bit more if you'd like. And also just kind of thinking about 2 years out and 3 years out, what do you think? What do you see?
Yeah, kind of lump those together. I think they are connected. So, clearly, Japan Tourism Agency says, we're seeing the largest fall on record. It's down 93% compared to March last year, almost decimated. So, this has the usual knock-on effects to travel agencies, cruise line operators, hotels, the traditional Japanese inns here, the ryokan. These are all, feeling the decline, of course, and the same goes for bars. Self-isolation obviously keeps customers at home. I think David probably has some points to mention there too.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think another thing I was just thinking about is with the decline of overseas tourism, there's also the potential for the flip side, which is an increase in domestic tourism. And so Japanese who would normally catch a flight to Hawaii or wherever are going to stay and do a staycation. And that might be good for the domestic tourist industry. We'll have to see. I mean, looking out 2 or 3 years from now, I see more of the same, really. The Olympics and all of the economic activity that's been sort of stimulative for Japan brings the question of what happens when all of those tens of billions of dollars disappear, what's going to replace it. The plan was tourism. I think it still is. That's been Prime Minister Abe's big goal. But I also think there's a bright spot with Japanese innovation. And what needs to be encouraged here to spur innovation is risk-taking. So we know the saying in Japan, deru kui wa utareru, which means the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. But that nail that sticks up creates innovation. So I'm hopeful that Japan will meet the challenge, but it's going to be a bumpy road for sure.
There was a question that came in from the audience about baseball season. And we've all heard, I don't know, yesterday, that was big news in my house because my husband is dying to see a baseball game and he's going to start watching Korean baseball because they started playing yesterday. Any thoughts on that, or has there been any talk about that? It may be too early.
Well, rather than comment on baseball, because I know nothing about it, I know that the teams in Korea have started. I saw the news. But I think it's interesting to look at the Korea-Japan relationship. And it's been rough the last couple of years. I suspect they're going to reconcile. And I think this pandemic for the regional relationships actually has great potential to soothe a lot of things. And in fact, I would suspect that even China-Japan relations are going to become closer, unlike the United States. They've done a good job here of soothing the pandemic problems. And I think even, especially with Taiwan closer, South Korea closer, North Korea, more of the same, don't see much change.
Yeah, I think there's also an interesting link to the question you asked about, how things are going to pan out, say, over the next 2-3 years. I think there are some broader questions that we have to address before we get down to specific, industries and in sports and these things. But, I think whether we focus here on Japan or zoom out globally, clearly we all have a stake in how COVID-19 evolves. We're all stakeholders in that sense going forward. However, we might also think of we all have collective interests that are clearly the same. So we'd all like to, I think, see the equivalent of a good baseball game, or we'd like to get back to work or whatever it might be. But we also have our individual interests that separate us into different demographic groups along different fault lines and these things. So I think the planning paths out of the crisis means that we're going to have some kind of framework for basically prioritizing the different demographics that are out there, the different stakeholders over the mid to long term. So specifically, if we look at resource allocation dilemmas, that's going to force us to recognize that we do have these competing needs between different stakeholder groups, and that's going to inevitably continue to emerge over the coming weeks and months. I think these issues are going to have to be prioritized and addressed accordingly. So setting the criteria by which we distinguish between the different levels of priority is going to be one of the first steps we're going to have to take before we can, I think, get back to enjoying the games and that kind of thing.
Great. Let's see. Let me see. I have some audience questions that came in ahead of time. Is that okay if I move to a couple of those? Okay, great. This one came from one of our board members, actually. For those of us who have offices in Japan and employ Japanese citizens, are you aware of any resources available or that may become available that they could consider to help their business and also limit adding to unemployment?
Yeah, so like the United States, Japan's initiated several stimulus programs, and I think those are going to be ongoing, just like the US, for individuals and companies. Individuals who are residents with an address here can get up to 100,000 yen like our $1,200 check per person, and that's been initiated. And then on the corporate side, almost 4 trillion yen for small and medium-sized enterprises has been provided to secure cash to stay afloat, and it's being distributed. And also about 2.4 trillion yen has been set aside for companies and solo proprietorships experiencing sort of severe financial loss. So the firms in those two categories can receive up to 2 million yen each, or self-employed individuals 1 million yen if their revenues have been halved, cut in half during the impact of the crisis. So there are programs here, and they're going to expand. They have to expand. I mean, it's getting tough here. I walked around Roppongi yesterday because I'm in that area, and it's not only restaurants that are closed for the month, but there's some of them just they're empty now. Their furniture's gone, and that's the new reality. Yeah.
I've seen some overlap there too on the Ministry of Labor. You know, you've got the website there for Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. Basically, the government of Japan's establishing a 1 trillion yen program to finance the small and medium-sized enterprises. So those are in cases where the loans aren't going to be enough to cope with the crisis. That same scheme, they say, allows for up to 10 billion yen per company with at least a billion yen worth of annual sales and a minimum of, say, 50 employees, they wrote. The main targets, they said, are going to be hotels, logistics, tourism, sort of the usual suspects, the ones you'd imagine in this situation. And then as far as I know, the stimulus package decision made last month is still where we are now. So, at that time, according to an article in the Japan Times, the central government approved its largest economic relief package that was, I think, 108 trillion yen. Chief economist at the Mitsubishi Research Institute, Takeda Yoko, she said, she was quoted as saying, helping companies cash management and basically protecting employment and supporting those who've lost their jobs were the top priorities for now. So the rescue package is focused on them. And then, as David mentioned, the small and mid-sized enterprises are going to receive up to 2 million yen each.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And this one, actually, a couple of people have asked this question. Is Japan doing anything to prepare for a second round or resurgence of COVID-19, which I think already happened in Hokkaido, isn't that right? But what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, when people refer to the second resurgence, I think they're talking about the fall and maybe even the winter. And to my knowledge, nothing's been done. At least whatever's been done has not been announced, and I doubt that they would announce it in advance of it being implemented. So Japan observes what other countries are doing and develops its own strategy accordingly. So I would presume that's what they're doing.
Yeah, we're on the same page there. I think the assumption is that, once you've worked out a full response to this first wave, you basically apply it then to the second wave. So, the other assumption seems to be that we'll have developed a partial or full herd immunity at some point. And, we'll also have antibody treatments coming out in the meantime. So either of those would make the whole challenge more manageable than it was the first time around anyway.
And I think on the communication side, which is my world, we don't have daily press briefings by Prime Minister Abe like we do with President Trump. So I think they approach communications with the populace in a very different way here.
And that's also going to lead to a situation with higher education, I would imagine. That's kind of a big overriding question, certainly in my house, but in a lot of the meetings that I've been listening to. Same there, I assume.
Oh, yeah. So we bumped our semester back a month, and I think that's been essentially buying time for both the professors and for the students to kind of get up to speed with using Zoom. So in the case of the university I'm with, they're using the Zoom platform as we're using now. And how do you maintain the same sort of quality in that new environment that you had before this crisis?
Great. And I guess we did talk about the Olympics already, but what about the general mood of the public? How are they feeling? And are there visible economic effects of that you can see already?
Well, I mean, I would just comment on that from the perspective of Japanese culture. And two concepts come to mind, gaman and shoganai. Gaman is persevere and grin and bear it, and shoganai is it can't be helped. So I think Japanese are very good at dealing with disappointment and crisis. They have crises all the time here: earthquakes, tsunami, typhoon, melting nuclear reactors. I mean, they're pretty used to this kind of thing, and I think most people are really disappointed. It was a great opportunity this year to showcase Japan, and it was a big disappointment. But perseverance, that's what Japanese are good at doing.
Yeah, I can just echo that. The mood here is understandably one of disappointment around that. And I think at the same time, there's a broad understanding that postponing really was the only sensible decision that could have been made at the time, given the information that we had. And what's more suspenseful now is, whether we'll actually be able to host the Olympics next year.
Absolutely. There's a lot of talk when I think next week in Colorado anyway, companies can have 50% of their workforce back in the office, and hopefully temperature checks and things like that are going to be happening as employees arrive. Is there any talk like that yet in Japan about when people go back, or is it not quite there? You have a longer stay at home ahead of you here. Still another.
No, it's not here. Nobody's talking about initiating that kind of thing. And in fact, I have a doctor friend who works at a hospital up in Saitama, and I talk to him all the time. And he said, we're not even wearing personal protection equipment every time we engage any kind of patient that comes to us. So they're just not at the same level of caution here that they are in the United States. And I see stores when I go to food shop. There are tape every 6 feet, just like in the United States now. So the awareness level is growing, but we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of sort of mitigating the risk by taking temperature checks and having antibody tests. I mean, I think the United States is a little bit ahead on this, but it's a global issue, right? And they'll come together and come up with some reasonable ways of making sure we can go back to flying safely and even going to concerts, right? Yeah, it's possible to have these things back again. It's just going to be a multi-year journey.
Absolutely. Abe's election is not until next year. Is that correct?
I think there's talk of that. I don't know that that's been confirmed.
It's not.
He's on his last term, but I think there's whispers of extending it by another year. I'm not sure where that is right now.
Is that right? Do you think minority political parties are leveraging this crisis at all? Well,
the opposition party often criticizes the Liberal Democratic Party for not focusing on human rights enough. And I think if the LDP doesn't do that in terms of prioritizing safety of the populace more, I think that it's an opportunity for them. But let's remember that the LDP has been in power almost every single year except for 1 or 2 years since 1955. They're a political machine here, and it's going to be hard to break that loggerhead.
Yeah, I think David's spoken for both of us on that point.
Great. I think, let's see, there is a question about education. Let me see, news reports are discussing a possible paradigm shift, moving the start of school in Japan from April to September. That's something that's been floating around again. Any thoughts on that from either of you?
Go ahead, Dylan.
Well, it just struck me as a sensible thought. If you've got the pandemic that you're trying to catch up with, and meanwhile you're trying to work out not just the costs, but what are some potential advantages here, it does present you with a unique moment to pause, reflect, hit the reset button, and do things in a new way that might actually be better going forward. Think of all those exchange programs that would be, let's say, a lot easier to coordinate if you're on the same clock with other countries.
Well, I don't want to say pessimistic. I'm a believer when I see it. Changing things here in Japan, even in a crisis, takes a lot of pressure. And unless there are really good reasons and there's synergy with like the business sector and, people who have to raise children and have a way in which their children can be taken care of, I'd be a little skeptical.
That is a tough one. And the study abroad issue is very real. We hear that all the time. So, interesting. Is there any other topic we've hit on today that either of you would like to expand any further?
Well, just one. Just the U.S.-Japan relationship. I think it's going to continue to strengthen. I've written multiple times since Donald Trump was elected almost 4 years ago that nothing's going to change, and I don't think it will. So I'm optimistic that this relationship gets stronger and it continues to be the epicenter of U.S. Strength and policy in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, I would just say, I think a lot of us are now inundated with all kinds of stories on a daily basis, and they tend to fall in the categories of a situation assessment, as in, what's unfolding today, like the latest. There's a bit of forecasting in there too about how are things likely to unfold going forward. But I just try to put a word in there for some of the more constructive thinking about how we as individuals want to also to try to take advantage of the different changes that are made possible in the crisis, and revisit what's important to each of us, and try to stay in that more positive state of mind to balance out some of the negative and stressful comments around where things might be going at the macro level.
That's great. Well, really, overall, I think although Japan, of course, has its uniqueness about it, there really is more similarities than differences between what's happening there and what's happening here, is my takeaway from all of this. I don't know if that's good or bad, but we're all going to get through it somehow. So
I mean, the biggest remaining issue for me and a lot of people who travel over the Pacific Ocean is Japan's ability to reinitiate normal flights. So right now, 87 countries are not allowed to enter Japan. People from 87 countries who've been in those countries for 14 days prior cannot come here. That includes the United States. So if you want to hop on a flight now from Denver, take that direct flight, you're not going to be allowed to come in. So that brings up a lot of logistical problems for a lot of people, especially people who ship goods and human bodies like us. And that means, right now you have to do something creative, like go to one country that's not on that 87 country list, stay there for 2 weeks, and then fly to Japan. I mean, I'm not sure about you, but I'm not too interested in going to Uzbekistan for 2 weeks and then flying to Tokyo. So, it's going to really impact things for a while here. And I think there's talk already of lifting it in the summer. We'll see.
That is a challenge. And, I mentioned our big sponsors at the very beginning, and Denver International Airport and United Airlines are on that list. So we are in close contact
I just
with
wanted to
them.
comment that nobody has waited longer for that direct flight than me. I mean, I've been flying over the Pacific for almost 40 years. I always used to have to go through the West Coast, and I love that direct flight. I take it all the time. Yeah.
It is fantastic. Fantastic. I agree. So, definitely looking forward to getting that back on track. Well, thank you both. Is there any closing remarks that you wanted to make before we end? Or I think that we've hit all of our questions. So thank you both so much for getting up early and joining us here in the United States to give us your point of view.
It was great. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank all of you here, the attendees, for joining us. I greatly appreciate you taking the time. If I missed your question somehow, please do feel free to email me, and I will try to circle back with our panelists and get an answer for you. So everybody have a great night or have a great day out there in Japan, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks. Goodbye.